Welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. It's me, Eric, here with you in the studio space to talk a little bit about prototype inspiration for the replacements for the tunnels that I've taken off of the layout. It's a Chicago layout. Tunnels don't really belong, but you've got to figure out something to put in their place. So today we'll talk a little bit about that. But hey, first off, you might be wondering, where the heck did the channel go in the last 4 months? Well, the answer is that pretty much all of my waking hours were spent doing science, which is my career. I'm a leukemia biologist, and so what that means is not only do we have to pay the bills through grants, but we also have discoveries that we need to publish. And for me, working with my team to get all of that settled is really a pleasure and an obligation, and so that takes first precedence. It wasn't all work, though. During this time, I still keep my weekly radio show schedule, and on top of that, also had time to run my springtime half marathon, this time just here in Denver, so no traveling out to sea level. I have to run just kind of like a normal person up here. In any case, let's talk about trains a little bit. So what you see here are two images of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad where the tunnels were removed. On the left, you see the front left side where there is a curve that curves towards the back of the layout. That was hidden in the places that you see. There's a catch hole over here for trying to remove the rail cars. And over here on the right, you see the right rear of the layout where there was, once again, a large shoebox tunnel and some associated rock structures that led all the way up to the front here, almost to the point where the bakery spur breaks off from the main line. There's a little ruler here for scale, but as you can tell, this in particular is a fairly large area. And once again, there is a catch hole back here for being able to retrieve derailed train cars. So let's take a look at a couple of examples that one can find in the Chicago area that might serve as inspiration for a locally plausible replacement for these items. So to make these things simple, I've called up some images on Google Earth. And of course, this is really useful because on Google Earth, you can manipulate in 3D any scene that you want, and you can do things like change the heading so you can get essentially a 360-degree inspection of whatever it is that you happen to be looking at from space. You know, this really is the age of miracles and wonder, given the fact that we can do this and we can use this sort of thing to find prototype information for a model railroad scene. So what you can see here is an overpass that covers a number of different tracks. This is essentially located in northeastern Indiana, just to the south and east of Chicago. So once you pass over the Skyway, you see this area, and this is part of the larger industrial area. This is the Cleveland Cliffs steel mill over here. This is that large, I think this is a BP refinery over here in Whiting. And this is an overpass that curves from a road over here into the Cleveland Cliffs area. So this provides access over all of these different railroad tracks over here. So why an overpass? Well, part of what I've been thinking about with respect to the rear right side of the layout is whether or not I could conceivably fit an overpass into that area. So part of the challenge with that is actually figuring out, if I'm going to put an overpass there, how am I actually going to arrange the stanchions that hold the thing up? I don't have a degree in civil engineering, and so therefore using images like this can be really, really helpful in figuring out how does one actually negotiate a bridge that moves over a curve or a curve that moves under a bridge, as the case may very well be for Chicago Crossing. Because remember, that spur track is curved, so I've got to be able to fit a structure over that. But thinking about how these support pillars are located in a realistic way ends up becoming kind of an important consideration, just to make sure that what you're building really does have a basis in reality. So here what you're seeing is a curved road moving over straight track. And what you notice if you zoom in is that these pillars basically remain in parallel to the railroad tracks all the way through. And that includes over here, you can see some patched graffiti, by the way, and some unpatched graffiti. Now, what ends up happening is you continue with these parallel paths regardless of the direction that the road actually curves, and that continues on and on all the way through the final stretch of this road. So that's actually really interesting, right? Because in this particular case, what it tells you is that you generally have to have parallel stanchions that hold up the entire highway structure. That might be important for considering with respect to Chicago Crossing and how that actually works. Here's sort of an interesting location as well, because once again, what you're seeing is you're seeing an actual change in the direction of these supports. So as the curve changes and as railroad tracks come from another direction, which once again is very similar to the curve in Chicago Crossing, what happens is that the pillars start kind of in this way, so parallel to that first set of tracks, but once you get the second set of tracks, here you see that now the direction of those pillars changes to parallel the other set of railroad trackage. So that's a good example of how prototype inspiration can be really useful in terms of guiding the construction of a new structure for the model railroad. The other thing that can be very, very useful here is to have access to look underneath and see what these pillars actually look like. Well, here's a good example. So we can actually fly in and see the road. And what you can tell is if you zoom in, you can get a better picture of how these pillars are actually arranged. So these are square concrete pieces with square concrete horizontal supports and squared off concrete bases as well. We can also get a closer up view over here where we fly in. And once again, what we can do is we can see how the underside of the structure is actually set up. And what's sort of interesting here is you've got some type of what almost looks like plywood decking underneath here for maintenance purposes or other things, I don't know. Again, I'm not an engineer. But the other cool thing that you can see here is you can see all of the detail on the underside that would be necessary for weathering and detailing in a way to make this look like a compelling old structure. So here's another good example from northeastern Indiana. This is I-90, the Indiana Toll Road, moving over a curved railroad track that passes underneath. This spur is one of several that serves industries in the area. And once again, we can zoom out for context. What you see is that we're actually just a bit to the south of the access road that we were investigating before. So we're essentially in Gary, Indiana right now. Here again is some steel mill infrastructure and the like. So let's come back to our highway over here. And again, we can use this to explore a little bit about how these structures are actually built over railroad tracks. And so one thing you can see is that if you look at the supports for I-90 in this area where it's actually elevated above the grade of the tracks, you can see that you have the supports actually moving in a perpendicular direction relative to the roadway itself. That's pretty standard. But what's cool is when you actually look at how the railroad itself is moving under this and how the road accommodates that in terms of support structures, you now notice that once again, almost as a rule, you have concrete supports that are working in parallel or moving in parallel to the roadway itself. In fact, you can see these expansion joints over here that represent a unique section that was built over these tracks. And so that's very likely why it has these additional specific supports. That's kind of cool to see. Again, I'm not a highway engineer, so I can make guesses as to how this stuff actually operates. So this is really, really good. It's helpful information. Do I want to build I-90 there or not? Well, that's a really interesting question. Part of that is, how does that actually scale with the amount of space I have in the layout? So one thing I can do here is actually to go ahead and measure what the real life distance is between the two ends of the road. I'm actually going to try to get that into feet. And so that's basically 119 feet. So we can use that information in order to provide a scale for how to plausibly build essentially a 6-lane highway with 2 hard shoulders on either side into Chicago Crossing if this is what I actually choose to do. So that takes care of freeways. Now we know at least a couple of ideas that we can actually put onto the layout in the rear corner there. Now, the next question is, what about the left front of the layout? And so here there's a couple of different options that we can explore. Well, if there's one thing that's evident about the way that the front left side of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad is, it's not an easy place to be putting an overpass structure, and I don't want to put two of those onto the layout. So what are the other options? Well, the city of Chicago, as it turns out, is replete with air rights uses that create pass-through building structures. Here's a really good example. This is over where Chicago Union Station is, and this is the entrance of the BNSF Metro line into the terminal for Union Station. So a couple of things become, readily apparent when you look at this type of overhead structure. Number one, in this particular case, it literally is just an overpass. So as much as we want to get away from that, well, we're kind of looking at an example where there is actually a roadway. But let's imagine that that's not necessarily the case. A couple of things that you notice. Number one is there's really not a lot of ceremony to this. There's no fancy keystone structure or anything like that. It doesn't look like a tunnel face, kind of like the nice concrete tunnel face that was on the layout before. Rather, it is a series of concrete retaining walls and then a concrete slab rail and vertical supports, much like what we had seen before. And that's it. It's not anything particularly special, but then behind it, you now have built structures. So once again, this is a really interesting example of how an overhead structure can be integrated into a layout. One could imagine that you're looking at a train in the front and it simply disappears in there, and then sure, it disappears out somewhere else. Here's another really good example. At this point, we're over in the near north side. Here you're looking at, I believe this is the Chicago and Northwestern station that comes out on the what are now Union Pacific trackage. But this is actually a really interesting area. The Cassidy Tires building was, I think, just right around here. I think it might even be like one of these structures over here or was one of these structures over in this block. So what we're looking at here are two examples of really interesting things that can essentially go track over track. One is, of course, the exit tracks from the railroad terminal that you can see just a few blocks up to or down to the south over there. Again, we're facing south right now. The other thing you see some tracks over on grade over here. This is the old Milwaukee Road trackage. So this would be out to, I think, the Milwaukee West service on Metra. And in any case, what you can see is this curves around. So you have a curve and a curve. And then it comes into a different structure over here. Again, I think all this stuff filters back into Union Station. I remember taking the Milwaukee a fair bit out of Union Station, so I think this is where it goes. And a couple of interesting things. We can, once again, sort of fly in and take a look at this structure. And so what you see is that it's, again, pretty unceremonious. It's basically just a set of what almost looks like just concrete work or something like that. You can zoom in and you can see these are essentially just tiles. And you can see a couple of garage openings here. That very likely is for this apartment building over here. You see a grade crossing. And then when you look inside of this tunnel, well, it's basically just overhead cover. And what's interesting is if we look at historical imagery, this wasn't here until 2014. So it's actually quite a contemporary structure. Now, of course, if we zoom back out and we ask what the heck is actually over here, what we find is that on top of this, there is a fairly nice looking piece of parkland. Now, I don't really think I want to build a beautiful little piece of parkland in Chicago Crossing. It just doesn't seem quite the atmosphere. But nonetheless, what it tells you is you can find pass-through structures like this, and certainly you can have stuff on top of them, in this case, a park. Well, if parkland isn't quite the right touch for the area that I'm trying to model, maybe here's a better example. So this is a relatively famous drawbridge that crosses the Chicago River. And you can still see some of the trackage that nowadays is abandoned and actually runs just sort of underneath this side of this track overpass. So again, you have another interesting example of how you might be able to model what we're seeing on the corner of Chicago Crossing. But if we come back to this structure over here, this bridge, back in the heyday of railroading over in this area, used to allow trains to cross and then pass essentially into this overhead structure over here. Nowadays, the track is all paved over, but the trains would actually move into this garage door over here. And at that point, they would pass underneath the merchandise mart, and they would end up coming out over onto Navy Pier. So that was basically the Navy Pier spur area. And one thing you can tell is that all of this stuff is, once again, pretty close by. This is literally just a block away from that other entrance we were looking at. So urban environments like this provide a lot of opportunities for finding pass-through structures that look just like this. And so in any case, what you can see is that you have a fairly large building facade. It's basically just a simple set of square windows and a series of overhead doors. Now, this is a fairly wide structure. It doesn't necessarily fit what Chicago Crossing would have available for real estate space in that area. But it does provide at least a little bit of prototype inspiration and, once again, just kind of a proof of concept that you actually can have a building with railroad tracks that just sit underneath. So here's a track level view of where those railroad tracks used to run. In this case, I think nowadays there may well be a door over here that covers this, but this is back in 2015. By this point, the Navy Pier spur was already inactive. However, the trackage on the other side, I think, was still in service for maybe one or two different industries like the Chicago Tribune printing plant and stuff like that. You can actually see this is where the trains ran through. And there's a lot of ductwork here, probably to remove exhaust from locomotives moving through the area. Once again, kind of an interesting opportunity to see ways to model an overhead structure that accommodates trains, but actually doesn't use them in any particular way as a freight service. It's simply a pass-through from one direction to the other. So, with all that in mind, where does that leave us? Well, at least for me, it provides a number of different options that I can use to create essentially a combination of different scenes and to at least understand what is plausible in the Chicago area for a pass-through structure, as well as for how a freeway or highway overpass actually interacts with railroad tracks beneath it and how those elements are structured. That's actually really important. The goal here is not to, again, recreate reality in a way that is 100% faithful to what is already in the city of Chicago. It's impossible to do that. The selective compression of a 7x3 layout and the scenic matter simply don't allow for it. Again, it's a work of fiction, but it can be a work of historical fiction in a sense. In other words, it's based off of real principles and real prototypes used as inspiration to make something that seems like it plausibly belongs there. So, time to get drawing up some plans. I think this will be a lot of fun. There are going to be a few interesting builds ahead as we start to tackle these questions. All right, until next time, take care.